In the late 1980s, a French teenager named Michel Ancel dreamed of making video games, and had taught himself how to code at the same time he was learning to draw. In 1988, his practice attracted the attention of local game publisher Ubisoft, who hired the 16-year-old to pitch and develop new games. He pitched a character that he called Rayman, named after the graphical technique of ray tracing that Ancel had become intrigued by, working to incorporate it into his current work. Ubisoft found this a captivating concept, and pushed to greenlight it promptly in 1992. They believed in it so thoroughly that they restructured the company to make sure the Rayman project had enough support and funding. They began developing it for the 16-bit Atari ST computer, but they found that the ST seemed to be on the downside of its lifespan, and went to research a different solution. They looked into a planned CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, but that peripheral project was abandoned before it was ever produced. They didn't feel that the base model cartridges of the Super NES could handle their aspirations, so they aimed for the new 64-bit Atari Jaguar. Initial marketing advertised Rayman as a Jaguar exclusive, but it was fortuitously decided to also make it a launch title for the new CD-based Sony PlayStation. Rayman tells the story of a harmonious land sent into disarray by an evil being named Mr. Dark, stealing the Great Protoon, an orb that is the source of all power and harmony on the planet. This scatters dozens of tiny beings called Electoons all over the world. Rayman, the guy, sets out to recollect the Electoons and defeat Mr. Dark. Rayman the game is a 2D side-scrolling platformer, the kind most commonly found on the Super Nintendo. Rayman was a conceptually understandable but technically challenging platformer, with a lot of innovative moves. You gain a telescopic fist as you move along, allowing Rayman to attack from distance. He gets other power-ups and bonuses, as well as maneuvers like ledge climbing, ring grappling, gliding hair blades, and power and speed fists. Rayman was a visually appealing game, but even more importantly, was an extremely responsive game, with sharp, intuitive controls no matter how many things they add to the playstyle, an essential achievement for such a challenging game. This led to the game being highly praised by critics and highly purchased by audiences. It sold nearly 1 million copies worldwide in its first couple years, and remains the highest-selling PlayStation game of all time in Europe. Critics praised its atmosphere, soundtrack, and animation, calling it a dazzling delight whose execution surmounts its overfamiliar structure. The team got to work on a sequel, planning to initially make it a side-scroller, similar to the first one. But around the time they began development, something changed their thinking: the release of the Nintendo 64, and specifically, their legendary launch title, Super Mario 64. Super Mario 64 was not the absolute first three-dimensional platformer. That would arguably be the 1995 PlayStation game Jumping Flash. But Super Mario 64 innovated in so many key ways. A clever, visually stunning open-world game that featured Nintendo's beloved mascot navigating a complex world of platforms and enemies. It was instantly considered one of the greatest and most revolutionary games ever made, and to this day is on the short list of the most acclaimed masterpieces the format has ever produced. In Super Mario 64's wake, the Nintendo 64 console became the vanguard of the 3D platformer genre, with warm, cartoony entries like Banjo-Kazooie, its sequel Banjo-Tooie, Space Station Silicon Valley, and Donkey Kong 64. Just as Rayman looks like a Super NES game on PlayStation, Rayman II: The Great Escape looks like a disc version of the Nintendo 64 style. Rayman II: The Great Escape was originally developed as a PC game, but mid-development they switched, fittingly, to the Nintendo 64. They had to reduce the quality of a lot of the textures to fit it on the cartridge, but nevertheless it became regarded as yet another great cartoony 3D platformer on the console, worth including in the same conversation as Banjo-Kazooie or Donkey Kong 64. On the first day of spring in the year 2000, Ubisoft released Rayman 2 for the Dreamcast, and the console's added power allowed them to revert the things they had to limit to fit on the N64 cartridge back to the extended detail of the PC, and even further that, adding 3D models where once were 2D sprites, to even wilder acclaim. The plot here is essentially the same, just with the specific details changed. Your helper isn't Bertilla the fairy, it's Lai the fairy. The powerful universal center is not the great Protoon, it's the primordial core. Instead of collecting tiny creatures called Electoons that have been spread around the world, you're collecting tiny things called Lums, which have been spread around the world. The same structure is involved, where you start with limited powers and then gain things as you go. But the switch from 2D to 3D is a very potentially tricky business, and I'm happy to report that Rayman II: The Great Escape navigates it ably and excellently. If I'm being honest, 3D platformer is not a genre I'm a particular fan of. I don't get much joy out of collectathons, I'm not a need number go up sort of gamer, and I find the inexactness of the platforming frustrating, especially in this early period where they were just figuring out how things like jumping distance and auto camera work in a three-dimensional world. That said, the Rayman 2 team do an excellent job of mitigating a lot of the pitfalls and potential issues I have with this genre. Its controls are responsive, its movement is fluid, and the camera is mostly quite intuitive. Even better, they have maintained the existence of Rayman's ability to rotate his hair like a helicopter, allowing you to float gently to nearly any plateau, which saves so much trial and error time, misjudging placement and plummeting into lava. Also, this is not really a feature, but I did have to laugh that the little floating assistant does this charmingly weird little whisper. A far cry from, "Hey, listen!" Other than Mario 64, the only 3D platformers of its era that I liked were things that were on rails, like the Crash Bandicoot games. Rayman 2 helped me remember the charms of the genre, simply by being thoughtful and exacting in ways that so few of them were. There's clearly a lot of care and planning put into this game. Unlike some games I've covered on this project, there is an intentionality to everything that happens here. It is, for instance, the exact antithesis of Sonic Adventure, a messy, sprawling, ragged game absolutely overstuffed with half-baked ideas, maddening, broken controls, wildly unclear goals, befuddling narrative dead ends, and a clear lack of creative cohesion. Rayman 2 is an example of what happens when a talented team has a clear goal in mind and executes it with care. It's not going to be any sort of personal favorite since it's still just not my style, but it was a fun game, and the word that came up over and over in my notes was pleasant. A charming, quirky, sunny, goofy little game that plays so well that it feels like nobody but Mario has ever quite measured up. Next time... You know how Rayman is sunny and pleasant and responsive? Well, there's a new raider in town now, and let me tell you, she sucks at everything.